Jennifer Bryan, costume designer for Genius Aretha. This season explores Aretha Franklin's musical genius, her incomparable career, and the immeasurable impact she had on music and culture. And I actually wanted to start there. Jennifer, Aretha Franklin, Queen of Soul, obviously musical genius, but her style is so unique and like so well known. I think that's like 1A for her legacy. Like, what was your first, doing her, coming onto this? What was your first experience though, or memory of her fashion and style in your own life? Like, when did you first encounter like her, her her style, basically, for lack of a better word?
I have to say, coming up as as a young girl and growing up in Jamaica, which is my homeland, I really can't remember a time as a teenager that I didn't hear her music. It was played in my house, and I certainly danced to it and all of that. So she's very much a part in the background of my growing up, and of course into adulthood hood, pardon. Yeah, it's like she's been around forever.
So when you come onto a project like this, where there is like obviously, you have such a long history with Aretha Franklin. I think like her, there's thousands, probably millions of photos of her. I mean, where do you even start when you're thinking of coming up with the costumes and stuff for this project?
Yes, research was quite intense and had to be very authentic and really spanned a really long era because her career was so exceptionally long. And of course, we also go back to her childhood. And I would say it was basically doing it in segments of eras. So in the let's say, for example, in the 60s, 50s, late 50s and 60s, and up to the early 70s, the main source of research for me for Aretha's life and her style and her concerts, her recordings, was really through print. It was through old Jet magazines, Ebony magazines, because back then that was really the main outlet for entertainers for bringing their fans into their world. There wasn't internet, and there wasn't talk shows came along a little bit later, but it was really about digging up old magazines and magazines that catered to the African American community in particular. Those the infamous Ebony magazines and Jet, and occasionally there would be articles in the more mainstream magazines, but primarily it was those. And oftentimes those photos were in black and white, they weren't in color, they were grainy. So that was really my main source in the earlier part of her career.
So that's really, so a lot of interesting things there. One of them is, like you said, like if you're working off like an old magazine or black and white. I mean, how do you then translate that when it's going to be shown, obviously in like color and on like an act, you know what I mean, like in moving and stuff? Like, I guess, how did you go from taking the old photos and translating that into the actual costumes?
Well, for the costumes that I had to duplicate or replicate, it was a bit of a challenge because some of the earlier ones really were only in black and white photos, and I had to decide, well, what color was that dress? One in particular is a concert where she was crowned the Queen of Soul, and there is only like two photographs that exist at the moment that she's crowned, and we had to kind of decipher, and the DP did help me on this, on whether the gown, we knew it was metallic, we knew it was reflective, you could see that in the photo, but what color was it? And we finally decided that it was silver, and we went forward with that. And then when I came across color photographs, even that presented a challenge because there were oftentimes they were old, they were faded, the color was destabilized, and I'm trying to really nail that color and like what shade of purple it is or what shade of green it is. So that was challenging, but eventually I narrowed it down to what I thought was a fairly accurate representation of some of the dresses that she wore.
So I was saying, I think what you were saying there about like the costumes, and especially coming up with the different things for the Queen of Soul costume. Also, I wanted to ask you about in the flashbacks when she's a child. A lot of those scenes are in black and white. Can you talk about like crafting the costumes then, for the black and white recreations, I guess, or those flashbacks and stuff, and how that differed maybe from like like you were saying, like transposing from black and white to color for those scenes, and then how you created those costumes, I guess, for her childhood and in those black and white scenes.
Right. So in the segments that we shot in black and white, it gave me a little bit more latitude, because I didn't have to necessarily replicate young Aretha's dresses. I was able to, create those from scratch. So I had latitude with color there. But then I had another mandate with black and white, is to create enough differences of hue and texture so that everything doesn't just look black, white, gray. You have to sort of really work on textures and patterns, and you use those to your advantage. Some of them to the naked eye might have seen a bit off, but when they were shot in black and white, I think it really created a really nice gradation, of colors, on especially on her little dresses. I did a lot of plaids. I did some plaids that had metallic thread in it. So with the black and white photography, you would pick up that little bounce of light. Those things were some of the things I took into consideration.
It's really great. I guess the other thing I wanted to ask you too is, like you were saying, we were talking, like, you're a lot of her dresses are so iconic. You have to like maybe recreate, or like definitely get that uh feeling as someone who, if someone is watching it, they're going to be like, I recognize that from Aretha Franklin. But also, you want to add in I'm sure you want to add in your own like personal touches, and like kind of like do those kind of things to make sure you're creating something for the project, I guess. Also, can you talk about balancing that, like the recreation versus being able to like use your own inspiration for some of the clothes?
Yes, well, luckily my director and showrunner, Susan Lloyd Parks, did give me the latitude to infuse my some of my creations into the things that we needed to duplicate. And because obviously, we're looking at fabrics and that really don't even exist anymore. And when you're trying to like copy something for line, you have to give yourself a little bit of latitude to nail it, but nail it with some inspiration and some fresh interest. So there are times when I had to have fabrics reprinted because I couldn't find that print anymore; it just didn't exist, and shift color a little bit, but still have enough essence of the original dress that so many viewers who would watch the show would remember, and in their mind's eye they can identify and go, oh yes, that was the dress that Aretha Franklin wore, or that dress was on her album cover. So it's a little bit of costume magic and then line for line replication. It's having to blend those two things together. um, you and as a designer, you'll still have enough room to really feel that you just didn't rubber stamp something, but that you created something that people still recognize within your own creation.
Yeah, and we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about Aretha's costumes and stuff, and they're obviously incredible. But watching it, I couldn't help but be like, wow, there's so many extras and there's so many characters that you have to like period appropriately costume. And I just was like blown away. Even like it's the smallest blurry background character, I'm sure, is like wearing like something that was very appropriate. Can you talk a little about like going that extra mile or whatever, like making sure that everything looked like in keeping with like the time and stuff, and like the challenges of that, let's say.
Oh, definitely. For example, those large church scenes, and believe me, we filled every pew in that church, and everybody, regardless of whether you were in the front row or whether you were up in the rafters. I cannot assume that you're going to be a blur. I'm going to assume that each one of you, everyone in those background, are going to get some kind of camera time. So, authenticity became very, very important. We pre-fitted, oh, hundreds of costumes, and making sure that everything that these background actors had, just as we do as I would with principal actors, that it falls within the realm of the period of the place, the church, and the time 50s, 60s, what have you. Yeah, everybody gets equal time and equal consideration.
Jennifer Bryan, thank you so much. Genius, Aretha, and stick around. We'll talk to you in a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you.